So another source of delight than having found like a last-minute place for conversation is to have like Sir Isaac Julien as the panel to kick off the conversation program. So we are really proud and honored of that. Isaac Julien needs little introduction. Since the 80s, he has constantly pushed back the boundaries of what it means to produce images. More than anything else, he manages to contain in his work forces that appears to be antinomic. In his films, Looking for Langston, he is both Viscontian in his attention to detail and refinement, and Casavetian in the exhilaration of his camera movement. Finally, a film like The Attendant combines high formal classicism with a campiness worthy of the most lustful corner of Castro Street. From the Sankofa film and video collective of the 80s, its early movie infused by post-punk energy to its film essay devoted to the historical and sentimental black figures such as Frantz Fanon or Alan Locke, we will explore, and that's a big task ahead of us, the 40 years of his works. From his atmospheric narrative to his architect and polyphonic movies on multiple screens, we have the exciting task to converse with him and about his long and acclaimed artistic career. Isaac Julien has now become synonym of beauty, transgression, and refinement. But above all, his work is poetic, a poetry illuminated by the thousand suns of freedom that nurtured generation of minds from the Harlem Renaissance to the left behind of neo-capitalism. So please follow me in welcoming Sir Isaac Julien with a warm round of applause. So our first question, as we are starting with the very beginning of your career, we wanted to know how did you come to art? What was the first spark that led you to become an artist?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to do this conversation and talk. And I much prefer conversations than doing lectures. And I should just say by way of answering your question that, in a way, my relationship to art is a kind of peculiar route. It's a peculiar route because, on the one hand, I was the typical, student or pupil in an East End art school, or you could say I was someone who was interested in painting, sculpture. I was practicing those things, and was, of course, wanting to do art. But at the same time, when I was very young, when I was 16, I was exposed to a group of filmmakers and artists, and encouraged to print my own photographs, and I knew about film sets when I was 16. So I was given this great expose to filmmaking at a very early age because of the hippie counterculture that lived across my street. And so I'm very indebted to hippies and very indebted to all the things that they taught me, because they gave me it was like studying art at a very early age as a teenager. So by the time I was 20, I knew what was experimental film, and I understood ideas around dialectical materialism. I was introduced to Brett and all of those ideas. It was like an expose in a very sort of unusual manner. So that's why I'm probably an unusual person today, to a certain extent, yeah.
So, influenced by political cinema, experimental cinema, as you described, you founded a collective of filmmakers in the 80s, the collective Sankofa. Could we come back to the early beginning of this collective?
Well, basically, you saw the photograph over here. It's suitably very 80s from the face. And we were a sort of young students who graduated from respective colleges, Goldsmiths, St Martin's School of Art, Polytechnic of Central London. And we came together because it was a very exciting time at the moment, the beginning of Channel 4. And also I had made some early films, Who Could Colin Roach? And with the collective, the first film we made together was called Territories, which, of course, it's very exciting that, Christine Vanache here from the Pompidou, when she saw Territories, said, we'd like the film for the collection. And I thought, really? Anyway, the rest is history. But basically, it's a work that I made at a very young age with the collective. And we came together because we just felt it'd be better to be a group rather than an individual. And of course, we were against authorship, individual authorship and all those old-fashioned ideas. And so you have, as it were, myself, Nadine Marsh-Edwards, Maureen Blackwood, and Martina Atele, who are in the group, all making films. And we had also a fifth member, Robert Cruz, who was like our theoretician, you could say, of the group, who came from Sri Lanka. So it was a mixed group, different interests, theoretical interests, filmmaking interests, and we were sort of, and so that's how it all began. Yeah.
So maybe we could start by speaking about Territories, which is a really interesting movie. I read that at some point you installed the camera in library bedroom to do it. So I was like, there's maybe also a connection with like a clubbing culture in the 80s. And so maybe what would be interesting as well is to guide us through the atmosphere of the 80s. Of course, AIDS, of course, Thatcher, what was it like? And also like a moment of a lot of initiative, artistic initiative. There was like the Black Audio Film Collective, among others.
Well, in very broad brushstrokes, I mean, the 80s, in a way, was a very exciting time. It's a time of counterculture. It's just after punk rock. It's just after I arrived in St. Martin's School of Art, and that was the center of where the Sex Pistols had their first concert. And I would say that the 80s, you had Thatcherism, you had brutal policing, you had unions that were kind of basically, being bashed out. It was a whole reconceptualization of what society would be. It was a sort of, it was a kind of volatile moment, but creatively an exciting moment. And you had different communities of interest. For myself, I had, I would say, the possibility for making different interventions. And so I would say that this moment was also very exciting because we had, if you like, people who were, for us, exemplars. We had Derek Jarman, who was like a very important figure for us, and James Mackay here is sitting with us, who was a great colleague of Derek Jarman. We were able to collaborate together on the wonderful exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery, where we made an expose of his films. We might see some of those images later. But we also had, if you like, at that particular moment, the sort of coming together, I would say, of different voices, the beginning of Channel 4 television, the possibility to be commissioned to make films in a more artisanian manner, and to be able to, in a way, make interventions which were possible, and we were crisscrossing between different forms. So there wasn't a separation the same sort of way. And I would say disco culture and queer culture was the nucleus for the exploration of different aesthetic interventions. So Lee Bowie was my dancing partner at many disco clubs. We used to basically get together afterwards for different meetings, and I filmed Territories from his studio, which was just on Notting Hill Gate, and that allowed me a certain sort of perspective. And of course, in a way, I think Carnival very much influenced the way that he was thinking about costumes and his general design sense. But at the same time, it was a moment where you had these different ruptures which were appearing. But I think with those ruptures, they were sort of creative enterprises to be able to create different sorts of interventions. So I think how Resistance was looking at that particular moment was quite a creative interpretation of how you could, in a way, make yourself, become part of an intervention. So fashion, painting, film, all of these things were colliding with one another on the disco club floor. And in a way, it was the possibility to try to bring that energy into the different spaces which we were occupied with. So when you talk about the polyphonic, that's very interesting because it brings together the sonic and all of these different ideas together.
Among these polyphonic voices you mentioned, we can also talk about the intellectual climate of this period and your first meeting with Stuart Hall, one of the fathers of the cultural studies, or Paul Gilroy, that have infused your work. Could we come back to this community, intellectual community, that you built around you at this time?
Well, I would say that someone like Stuart Hall was the kind of father of cultural studies, along with Raymond Williams, but he was also someone who was working very much in the arts. He was, in a sense, at the forefront of commissioning the architect David Adjaye and Adjaye Associates to make their first art building in London, the first museum space. He was also head of an organisation called Autograph, Association of Black Photographers. But he was also there in the very beginning when I made a film called Who Could Colin Roach? You know, today we've been going through the archives of that work, and we found the whole Roach for Family Support Committee about how this young man died in the police station. And Stuart Hall's essay introduces this whole report around policing. But as everybody knows, he was someone who was a semiotician. He was someone who was incredibly talented and charismatic in terms of the way he was able to translate very sophisticated theoretical ideas and to make those become not commonsensual, but to lead in a particular way. And so I would say that, you know, Stuart Hall was a sort of cultural, you could say, hero, very charismatic, translating lots of different Derridian, Foucauldian, French ideas into into an Anglophone space, but then at the same time he had his own philosophy. And so I think he was incredibly unique, and him along with writers like Paul Gilroy, and then later on we'd meet people like Françoise Vergès, who was almost like a sort of French counterpart or became part of our circle. And you know, it was generally a very expansive time, you know, but I would say that a lot of my work has been a translation of sort of both intellectual ideas, but in another area around the aesthetic, you know. But I mean, someone like Stuart Hall was very interested in art as well. So I think those two things coalesced.
Is it because of him or thanks to him that you, like in your work, you have been able to navigate between theory and pop culture? I mean, because from what I read, he was like a person who was like both, you know, feeling home in the university and in a club. He was able to navigate both of these space. And your work is also a testimony of that, to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was very interested in popular culture. Of course, cultural studies was very interested in popular culture. And I do think he was someone who was able to create a language of accessibility that was able to create a kind of convivial space for the exchange of ideas and to animate, as it were, a whole sort of art scene and sort of scene on the left generally.
And another mentor of the 80s, obviously, is Derek Jarman. You devoted a documentary film to him. You did an exhibition at Serpentine and Kunsthalle Zurich, if I remember well. Could you maybe tell us more about how you met him? Because you speak of him as your mentor. And how did your relationship develop, work-wise, intellectually-wise?
Well, I would say that, you know, that my relationship to Derek, I mean, James is the person who is the Derek Jarman sort of connoisseur here. I mean, I'm someone who was able to be, you know, close by to Derek because he was making amazing films, films like The Last of England, Reimagine October, films which were sort of, in a way, making an intervention into British cinema, but were very closely related to the fine arts. So his film on Caravaggio, The idea that he was also painting, and he was an incredible literary writer, and in a way being someone who's at the forefront as an AIDS activist, but doing that work in a very elegant way, you could say, I think. And he was really at the forefront of a movement. So in a sense, I mean, we have Ruby Rich here, who wrote about the New Queer Cinema manifesto and created the term, but he was at the forefront, I would say, of creating the language for New Queer Cinema. Edward II, of course, was the film which, in a way, I think, fused these different moments together between high art and his literary sources and activism. And, of course, I collaborated with James Mackay and Tilda Swinton on a documentary called Derek, and we made an exhibition called Brutal Beauty at the Serpentine, and this was, in a way, encapsulating what I felt was some of the excitement that Jarman represented for us at a time where I felt that his legacy was sort of waning. We felt like it'd be good to make that memory of his work stand out.
And he was a huge influence in looking for Langston. So maybe you could delve into the first, this really important work of yours. For example, in the introduction, I said that there was some kind of casavetes. I mean, we have this word in French, ivresse, which I'm not sure is like really translatable in English, but like exhilaration or inebriation. But this idea that the camera follows a kind of champagne that flows in the glass, this kind of joy. And a second, I mean, formally, a second like influence that I saw was this content, I mean, this attachment to the detail, to like recreating an atmosphere down to the tiniest, costume, stable design, almost a period room being filmed. So first, would you agree with these two influences? And second, maybe could you introduce us to Looking for Langston?
Well, Looking for Langston was the first, I would say, in quotations. We did make a number of films, which are different types of films, but I think by the time, in 1989, Vancouver Film Video Collective was able to hone its skills, so to speak, and I think Look for Langston was the film which enabled that to happen. There was a kind of sixth member of the Vancouver Film Video Collective, Mark Nash, who's sitting here at the front.
Thank you for referring to me, but I think you're out of sync with the images.
No, everything is out of sync. So let's try to find looking.
Look here. Ruby. Ruby. Territories.
So I think it's
Colin
after.
Roach. This is the Serpentine Gallery.
Exactly.
Exhibition we did.
Maybe
Super 8 films. And the next is Looking for Langston.
Exactly.
So we've caught up. Thank you, Mark. And in a way, this connects, as it were, the kind of strands, so having the access and close proximity to Jarman's work, and then being able to fuse that with my own interests, Black modernism, what I saw as the lost chapter in art history of the Black Arts movement, and to fuse that together with the queer aesthetics, you could say, that Jarman had created, and then to bring forward the sort of, Black voices, the poets Essex Hemphill, Langston Hughes, the controversy which ensured with the Hughes estate, because in a sense I was outing Langston Hughes, and in a way to bring these different metaphors together. So here we have this Angel of History photograph, kind of Walter Benjamin quote, you could say, visualized and translated into the possibility for trying to create this kind of detailed decor, pictorial history, where you use the archives as a space for reinvention, So instead of looking at archives as a space that has absence, it's a space for reinvention, and that reinvention would be looking at the photography of George Platt Lies, for example, and May 4th, and then being able to picture that in this black and white sort of photographic sort of history or film noir cinematic translation of some of these histories into the present, then, yeah.
And reinvention as well through poetry. I mean, because I read that you consider yourself first and foremost as a poet, and that you collaborate a lot with poets in your movies, but also like you use like, I mean, we could say you use like poetical strategies in your movies, like allegories, metaphors. And so maybe I wanted to hear you more about that, like the use of poetry and how important is it, and especially in looking for Langston.
Maybe we should change the image. Okay, no, we can go back. Not too back, sorry. If you go to the... Yeah, we can start this image. I mean, I would say that you could say, yes, I mean, I would say a visual poet, you know, in the same way that sort of, I think, you can make, you know, people always talk about film as storytelling, but it's also about pictures, or I'm interested in pictures. And I would say that the kind of poetic aspect comes in relationship to looking at the history of cinema, Vertov, Mayakovsky as a poet, or looking at its translation in a kind of visual terrain where you don't separate, you know, the pictorial and the visual. And I would say, of course, in a film like Looking for Langston, it was really about how one could sort of match the poetic text with the image that wouldn't be just illustrative, but would form a sort of dialectic. And so that's something which I tried to return to in my latest work, Statues Never Die, but it all begins really with a film like Looking for Langston, where you're sort of trying to match the fierce words of the late poet Essex Hemphill, talking about desire and love in the time of AIDS, and how that can become a kind of passionate quest for identity and survival. And yeah, and so I think there's all of those things are going on. Yeah.
There was also a moment where you was extremely interested by different gaze. You made like a different typology from the male gaze to the gay gaze, the racist gaze, the black gaze, and how this operates to make a relecture of a queer subculture of Harlem Renaissance. And I was curious if you link this interrogation of the gaze with what you call the aesthetic of reparation.
So now if you go to the next slide. This is a slide with Fanon, yes, because this is where the francophone comes in, and with the kind of francophone ideas around the gaze. And of course, I would say we were obsessed with Lacan at a particular moment in our circles. And of course, one of the things that we tried to do, I would say, within the kind of black circles which we were interested in, was really thinking about the black gaze and what that looks like for making art, what that looks like for making images. And that's where the interest in Fanon developed. So I would say that in the mid-90s, we were in a stage of Fanon mania. And there was even an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, which was called Mirage, Enigmas of Race and Desire and Difference, which we staged a very famous collaboration with Homie Barber, Stuart Hoare, Paul Gilroy, Cobben Mercer. And this ended in an exhibition, a conceptual exhibition, where Steve McQueen showed his first work, and various other artists, Glenn Ligon, Renee Green. And this sort of moment was really about how we can create a sort of way of sort of the look as something which we had thought a lot about in more theoretical terms. How could that be extrapolated for making a sort of visual culture or visual intervention, both in films and in art generally? And so this expanded, and we used the kind of Fanonian ideas which of course came out of the whole debate between Sartrean sort of aesthetics and the question of alienation, and in a way, all of that became part of a way of trying to repicture the look, you know, because the look we saw it as being hierarchical, but, you know, in terms of questions around racism, you know, what was the kind of fetishism in that gaze? You know, it's so prevalent in a general culture, but I think we were interested in analyzing that, but then also doing something else with it, not just leaving it in a kind of theoretical realm, but moving it into other areas. You know, so we had lots of very interesting debates, which resulted in the works that we made, and the Fanon film was part of that. And working with Marc, working with Françoise Vergès, coming to Paris, going to Martinique, looking at the way that these ideas were sort of around ontology, and they're all very exciting to us at that particular moment.
And that movie gave you also a new sense of structure. That was a moment when you intersect different movie genres, the documentary, fictional element, critical essay, archival footage, reenactment, symbolic imaginary. Different way to maybe talk about conflictual gaze or identities. So it was also intellectual moment of rupture for you in your cinema, this final movie.
Yeah, should we go to the next image?
Of course.
Oh, because you've restructured the images.
No.
But you could say that sort of the question of bricolage or montage was all part of this rupture. And the kind of rupture was really about what then are the questions of desire that get created in this moment of rupture, not just the kind of dissonance of, say, violence, or where does violence go, and what are its overflows, you could say, and different registers. So, of course, you know, there's a film like The Attendant, which is quite connected to the Fanon film, but people might not think so. And in a way, kind of the question of access, and also, I think it's really about the question of desire, that desire produces these ambivalences, but also produces this surplus aspect, which becomes a way of exploring, you know, what could be taboo subjects, but relevant subjects. And I think this, you know, and I feel like the role of art is about that. It's about going to those spaces, which are not just about transgressions, but also about pushing boundaries, but creating a kind of frisson, which can create a possible different way for looking, generally.
And it was around that time, Pierre told me yesterday that in the early 90s, he told me Isaac was being seduced by the Hollywoodian studios. And he had the choice in his life, like between, you know, a Hollywoodian career or, you know, like an artist career. Is it true? Did you refuse the Hollywood, Los Angeles lifestyle and career?
I mean, I had my Hollywood meetings after I did Young Cerebrals. You know, I went to Los Angeles. I had a few meetings. I was given a very odd script that I could have directed. I didn't think it would have been a very good film to have made about a babysitter. I don't think it was going to go very well with my career somehow. And yeah, I mean, there was a kind of possibility doing Young Cerebrals, winning the Semaine de Critique Prize. I mean, there's a lot of interest, going to Sundance, all those kinds of things. But I think in a way, and it's about the time, I think when I met Glenn Scott Wright, making The Attendant, and I knew that in the prophetic sense, it was set in a museum, it was about an art gallery, and I wanted to go back to exploring things in a sort of arts context, because I found the film context to be too rigid. It was not like France, you know. British cinema is a very different cinema. It's a very boring cinema. And so in a way, I think there's a way we could have much more fun in the art context from my point of view. Maybe we can go to the next slide.
But we could speak about the attendant, by the way.
Well, we could, yes, because the attendant is a work which... Because you changed all the slides. What's the slide after this? If we go forward, no,
after we go to Playtime.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So we go like too far.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you could say that in The Attendant, it's the first work which is situated in 1993 in a museum, shot in the Royal Academy, and it's exploring these questions of abolitionist pathos, but translated into the eros for a kind of new desire, queer desire. So I was interested in the significations of the apparatus of chains and whips and how they could be transported into another arena. Because at the time when I made this work, people were being imprisoned for committing S&M acts in Britain as part of the Thatcherist regime, right? And so I think there were these sorts of questions, but at the same time, I thought there was another sort of question behind what I saw as a perhaps laissez-faire way of thinking about these questions, which was really the ghost of the imperial aspect of slavery, you could say, as a signifier in history. So, yeah, I mean, these are all the kinds of things we are thinking about. But of course, if I think about Stuart Hall, his sort of methodology was about signs are never fixed in history, that signs can be unfixed, and they have a different relationship historically to how they may be perceived in one moment versus another moment. So this is a moment where the signs are slippery and they're changing, you could say, and they get re-articulated. So I think these are different ideas which I was playing with in that work.
Yeah, and I think looking for Langston and The Attendant both believe in the kind of revolutionary potential of queer desire. Because earlier on, you were saying that you wanted to reinvent the archive. And in some ways, in some films, we could say that there is almost a kind of a libidinal investment of the archive, a queer libidinal investment, that we could reinvent them through gay desire. And would you agree with that? Would you think, for example, The Attendant is like a testimony of that?
I think there are always libidinal investments in looking and in desire. And that's why you have the popularity of someone like Trump, you know, because it's not just to do with the question of queerness, it's to do with the way in which the libidinal desire of the political discourse at a particular time is always intrinsically connected to the questions of desire, and that those questions of desire are not necessarily revolutionary, they can be quite reactionary. You know, and so I think this question of the libidinal investment, you know, which is where we get into the kind of, you know, murky, could be interesting, but sort of like, you know, uncanny area, is precisely around these aspects, you know, because it's to do with the kind of forbidden desire and the way in which that becomes, as it were, a place of excitement and frisson, both for making political votes and also for doing a number of politically incorrect things, you know. So, you know, and I think that is why politics gets it wrong so much. So I'm not answering your question in a different way, of course.
So maybe what would be interesting would be to connect also your work with French or Francophone culture in general, and also to the work of Edouard Glissant, and of course the concept of creolization. Could you maybe tell us more about that, his influence in your work, both maybe like in terms of display, I think, and formally and theoretically?
Well, interestingly enough, you know, Mark and I, when we were making the France Fanon film, we approached Edouard Glissant to be in the film. And, well, he said he would be in it, but then he never...
He was too busy with his own museum.
That's right, he was too busy with his own museum at the time. Yeah. I think he was wondering, why are we making a film about Frantz Fanon when we could have made a film about Edouard de Clisson, you know, which is a good question, you know. But at that time, as I said, we were in Fanon mania, and he knew Fanon very well, so he had lots of different possibilities for, you know, in a way, trying to connect, but he didn't want to connect at that particular time, you know. But I would say that, of course, we were interested in his work at that particular time, the same way we were interested in Maurice Condé, and so in a way, the kind of, and if you like, even, you know, in a sense, during the same period, you know, there's a way in which some of the ideas inform some of the works which we made later on at the Pompidou. But to get back to Clisson and his ideas, I mean, I think at the time, you know, he was not being read by people. He wasn't the lingua franca of the art world. This is the mid-90s, and there are lots of concepts which we were interested in terms of his sort of ideas. And so I think the concept of trembling, of the question of creolization, trembling thought, the idea of islands, archipelagos, archipelagic thinking, all of these things were very much alive, you know, and they're kind of alive in different works, like in the Phantom Creole work, but they're not, in a way, they're not at the forefront, you could say. They're embedded within the sort of structures of the work in terms of how I was thinking at that particular time in concert with others.
So Clisson, Fanon, but also with the project of Phantom Creole, you've been confronted with different collections in France. And
Let's go to the next slide now.
Yep.
Especially
No relation whatsoever with Phantom Creole.
the book of Michel Léris, L'Afrique Fantôme, The Ghost Africa.
Let's go to the front. Need to go back. Back again. Where's the Phantom Creole image? There. Here we are.
So the Michel Léris, L'Afrique Fantôme, where surrealism meets early ethnography, but also the trip to Congo, Voyage au Congo, a movie by Marc Allégret and André Gilles from 1927.
Yes, I mean, in a way, this was a really exciting period when I was working with Christine Van Asch at the Pompidou, and we wanted to make a work which would somehow delve into the archive and to try to, in a way, look at this sort of moment in Francophone cinematic visual culture in both a literary sense but also in a cinematic sense. And I was involved in my own voyages, you could say, or tours into Africa, going to Ouagadougou, to the film festival, going to the Arctic north. And in this work, Phantom Creole, it's a combination of the two different spaces. And I was interested in this question of creolization. That's why it's called Phantom Creole. The creolization is opposite, if you like, regions around sort of climatical differences, and to fuse those in terms of the cinematic, if you like, legacy of those voyages that had taken place, because I was re-following those steps, the steps of Matthew Henson, the explorer went to North Pole, the Black Explorer, and then with Matthew Perry, and then, of course, in terms of the sort of Francophone explorers in Africa, you know, and to fuse those moments and movements. And the thing that was very interesting about making that work was also the question around spectatorship, because I was also thinking about the ways in which, and we wanted to break, I think, at that time, Christine, with what we saw as the sort of free screen work, as a sort of way of thinking about expanded cinema, and to make a sort of work that would push the spectator into this position of being able to view from different perspectives. So it was also about the creolization of vision, you know, and to think about that as a question Of course, what the spectators did is they got their seats and they moved them to the area where they could view all the screens simultaneously, and that wasn't meant to happen. So that led to a different way of thinking about making multiple screen works.
So that was a moment when you started to include way more architecture, multiple screen, as you said, maybe a creation of form, and what we could call expanded cinema. It was the end of the 80s context and the disappearance of capital for cultural projects. A lot of artists in the 90s started to move in the art world. But in the 2000, the scale of production were even more developed, I will say. And on a more structural aspect, the expanded cinema could be described as something immersive, implying multiple screen, permitting maybe to deconstruct the narration. It permits also to let the viewer as a monteur, and to maybe to have a third meaning emerge, to playing with different voices, geographies, time, and that's what permits expanded cinema.
Yes, in a way, if you go to the other images, not that way, the other, okay.
Which way?
I'm
Back?
I think it's forward, isn't it?
Yeah, like 10,000 waves, Playtime.
Precisely, yeah. So if you stop at the lessons of the hour, for example, you know, it's a multiple screen work where the question of architecture, the use of the screens, the way in which one thinks about the spectator being able to move to different positions. If we go to the next slide, this is a work called Lina Bardi and Marvellous Entanglement from the Maxi Museum in Rome, where basically, you know, the question of expanded cinema becomes part of the way in which I'm in dialogue with the architect, Lina Bardi, in thinking about the architectural frame and making a work which is a biopic, essentially, about her, which is in conversation with Afro-Brazilian cultures, but the spatialization of the work and how it was in conversation with Zaid in that space was also about the space of making works of an expanded cinema nature in a museum. Because, of course, the question would be, why would you do that when you can go to the cinema, you know, and rest in your seat and see a film? So I think it's that question about the why, and then to explore that visually in a sort of expanded manner, which creates what I think an exciting frisson around looking, you know, and breaks the ways in which we look ordinarily. So if we go to the next slide, again in this work in 10,000 Waves, this is the work which in a sense, I would say, solves the issue that I had, you could say, with Phantom Creole, which wasn't really an issue because it's a way of jumping from one idea to the other. But in this work, in 10,000 Waves, people or the audience actually got the idea that you could view from different perspectives, and that was a fun thing to do, or they got it. It wasn't necessarily something which was frustrating the viewer. And that was a way, I think, of, you know, because we learned, I think, from our sort of interesting curatorial sort of, if you like, experiments in terms of the exhibition space for making moving image works, where you can then begin to make a scenography which is polyphonic and sonic, and this the way that the sound structured this viewing, you know, people got to the idea of, you know, what one was trying to aim at, so to speak.
So we don't have a lot of time remaining, but maybe it would be interesting to speak about this work. So it all started with like a tragic story, which is like a Chinese worker dying, sinking in the sea next to the English coast while picking shells. And from that, you constructed a narrative, also embedding Chinese mythology with a goddess Mazu. So in a way, it kind of it's built up. It's like a palimpsest of all your obsession formally. Found footage, like police found footage. It starts with that. Then you recreated the goddess, 2099, a silent Shanghai movie, and then you filmed the goddess Mathu. So maybe could you tell us more? Because it's in some ways it seems to grasp like the will to also do a classical movie when you recreate the goddess, and also the will to completely deconstruct everything and to do like multiple point of view, and not obeying with like a linear narrative.
Well, I think one of the main things really is the question of, I've made quite a mess there. I think the main thing is that there's a sort of, you could say, the question of migration in Europe, from my point of view, is a provincial conversation. It's about the provinciality of Europe and its so-called borders. And I think in the representation of Chinese culture, for me, it gave a sort of avenue for thinking about people who ended up in this tragic circumstance from the Fujian province on the shores of northwest England, where they drowned picking cockle shells, for a living. But really, I think also at the same time, I wanted to not do what the dominant media does, which is they told a story, then we forget it. This is really tragic. So what I did was to commission a poet, Wang Ping, who is an amazing poet. A year later, she produced a poem, and in a way from that poem, I was able to think about, through our research in the studio, how to approach this. And we found that from the Fujian province, Mazu, the goddess of the sea, a deity that was just prayed to from the whole southeast region, is the person that brings sailors to spaces of safety at the times of peril. And perhaps in this instance, she wasn't able to do that. Because I think one of the sort of stereotypes of how things like this are generally reported is, in a way, a certain political expediency, that these stories need to be told in a documentary form, they should be newsworthy, and then we move on to the next. And so I wanted to do something which was like an allegory, an allegorical take. And through the Mazu story, I was able to look at this, not from my point of view, but from Mazu's point of view, to look at this whole event, this tragedy which occurred. And that, in a way, gave me a way of saying that in Chinese culture, people have been traveling from this area for 3,000 years. So what do you do with cultures that travel for 3,000 years? And what does it look like if you make that your quest in the work? So it ended up with me going back to the Ming period and looking at this story from that perspective as a way of proving the point of the provinciality of Europe in relationship to these questions. And also the kind of aesthetic quest in terms of the work, in terms of the exploration of what these journeys look like. Because as it says in the poem, people will keep traveling. It doesn't matter what obstacles will be put in their way. You cannot celebrate technological telecommunications at the moment in the 21st century and pretend that bodies won't follow those routes of dissemination. And so, in a sense, I would say in making 10,000 Waves, it was really the kind of possibility as well to move away from one's own identity, to transgress what it is that a black gay person should make, and to have that transcultural identification, and to say that in the world, we can make those transnational identifications a possibility by looking at the different ways in which we are in, as it were, a moment of globalization in a sort of art context. But I was really interested in this Glissonian idea of the archipelagos, of the little ideas, the little thoughts that can be built together in different forms of identification in the work. So that's a rather long-winded explanation of making 10,000 Waves.
Thank you. I think now it's time to open to the question to the public, from the public. Est-ce qu'on a un micro ou on fait ça a cappella?
I had a question about your process of writing. Excuse me. You talked about the archive as a place of creative activation, and I just watched Statues Also Die. Is that what it's called?
Never die.
Statues Never Die. Sorry.
Marker from Statues Also Die.
Yeah. In London, so I went to that several times. And I remember this line, "We cannot let the weather determine our fate." And I was really interested in how, like, your own process of writing, and if are you writing all the text, or are you incorporating documents, like archival documents of actual text, or is it all sort of like flowing together in the process?
Well, in a way, I guess, just to answer your question, in the case of a film like Statues Never Die, maybe you can go to the next image. Oh, that's the last image. Here we go. Yeah, this is Statues Never Die. Once again, Statues Never Die. I mean, that work is essentially a series of quotations. You know, so none of the texts are my own texts. They're all archival texts. But I think one of the main things we thought about in the whole debate around the sort of question of reparation of objects, restitution, was I was looking for a poetic form of restitution. But all the sources are kind of quoted from text. So, for example, the text which you just quoted is from a text that Bell Hooks wrote called Winter, which is in the catalogue that we did for MoMA. And the text is about a snowstorm where she describes herself and myself being trapped in a snowstorm in the West Village. And in it, it's a kind of manifesto for thinking about, you could say, the black imaginary. You know, and so in the process, it's really about quoting from different texts. And I think the main thing that we found is that we kept going back to the 50s. We kept going back to Francophone texts in the 50s, in fact, you know, because those were the only texts which had a kind of poetic response to be able to explore certain questions, along with some of the writers of that particular time, and then, of course, the late Bell Hooks. So I'd say it's a mollage, it's a bricolage, and they're quotations which are sutured together basically to form a kind of narration. Yeah, and that's a particular way I like working when I can.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.